All right, let's get started. Thanks everyone for being here for this talk on decoupled CMSs. I titled it Drupal Unhitched, the CMS in Decoupled Architectures. There were so many bad puns that I went through before arriving here, and I'm still not quite satisfied. But we'll keep going through. I am Mark Lobrera. I am the Technology Director for Blue Cadet Philadelphia. That's my Twitter handle and Blue Cadets. Just a few quick things about us. We're an experienced design firm. Our home office is here in Philadelphia, in Fishtown. But we do have a New York office that's rapidly growing, so we're now a two-city firm. And we do a lot of work across a pretty wide spectrum. We're a bit of an oddball in the sense that we are situated, and most of our clients are in the nonprofit, museum, higher ed zone. So we don't do a ton of commercial work, and most of our work is in sort of like the just slightly left of center for agency work. So we do big CMS and web projects, and also a lot of museum exhibition work. So touch and sensor-driven interactives, whether that's a touchscreen or a Kinect-driven experience. Projection work. So the image on the right is from an exhibition we did in Chicago around Van Gogh's bedroom paintings, and it was a combination of a touchscreen interactive and a projection piece that we did. We also do a bit of film and photography work. So that's my colleague Dan, who was shooting. This is work we did for Princeton. We did their admission site a couple of years ago, and so we also did a lot of the film and video content for that. And we also think about spaces. So we also help clients like the Visitor Center here in Philly think about space and also design and branding. A quick note, and I like to have this in front of basically every talk that I give. Everything in here is intended to be descriptive and not prescriptive. I am not telling you how to do these things, but I hope that the story and the things that my team and I have been doing is somehow helpful for you, and that you get to try out some of these things as well. What are we going to cover today? We'll cover three broad things. And so before I do that, a few quick questions, just show of hands. How many of you here have heard of decoupled or headless CMSs? Okay, so that's good. I feel like this is probably like the third or fourth time I've done this is like a Frankenstein talk of previous decoupled talks, and I feel like this year the audience is slightly different. Follow-up, how many have been building decoupled applications? Have you shipped? Okay, so this is good. This is good, because we're going to cover a lot of ground, and hopefully this will inspire you, and hopefully you'll see that it's not a lot of ground to cover. This is the type of thing that isn't, you can control how big that lift and that scale is in terms of architectures. So we're going to cover three broad topics today. One is we'll just review really quickly what a decoupled CMS is so that we're all on the same page in terms of terminology. I'll cover a couple of decoupled scenarios drawn from Blue Cadet's work across the web and interactive applications that we've built. And hopefully there'll be some inspiration there. And like I said, what I really hope for people is that you'll see that, oh, I don't have to go all the way on this end and like tear everything up and redo everything. Like there's actual incremental steps that you can take along the way. And finally, I'll just discuss specifically how to decouple some popular and straightforward ways that we've used to decouple Drupal in these architectures. So, everybody feeling good? Yeah? Okay, let's dive in. What is a decoupled CMS? I tend to use decoupled and headless interchangeably, even though they are slightly different in my mind. I prefer decoupled for the work that my team and I do at Blue Cadet because Headless, whenever I hear that, it implies one head, one thing that renders the front end. But at Blue Cadet, we often do multi-product projects, as you'll see later on when I go through a couple of the architecture examples. I was at Jody Hamilton's talk earlier about JSON API and React and Drupal, and I think she made a really good point, encouraging people not to think of decoupled as all or nothing, like, oh, I need to just start doing all my front-end stuff in React or Vue, and everything, all this accumulated knowledge that I have in Drupal or WordPress is now like, oh, this is like going away. Rather, I hope you think again of it as being an incremental step that you can progress through in stages, and that you can mix in some of these newer front-end technologies with the existing knowledge that you have around building WordPress and Drupal sites and CMSs. So a decoupled CMS broadly is an architecture for websites and applications where the CMS is not used to render the user-facing site or application. So that just means that you're separating out concerns. So your front end and your CMS or your back end, you're starting to literally unlink those two together so that what you do in one doesn't necessarily require you to have a cascading effect all the way through to the other side. And this is not new to any of us who've worked in the web for, we always hear this common adage, which is separating content from presentation. And it's a rule of thumb that is often, not always, but it's often good advice. And so that separation of concerns that I talked about can help focus, right? Where if you're thinking of your content in slightly more abstract terms without immediately marrying it to how it's going to be represented on the front end, it can open up some really interesting avenues for you to make your content more portable and get it ready to travel places. So I hope that's helpful. You'll often hear people describe it as being like, oh, this just means I'm using React for the front end, and I'm about to step into decoupled scenarios, and I hope you see that that's not necessarily the only situation you can find yourself in. So, a couple of decoupled scenarios. And these are not a linear progression. This is just, I kind of arranged them in terms of order in which we did these projects. So don't think that this is like, oh, foundational and building and building. This is more just a snapshot of 5 or 6 projects that we've done recently using decoupled CMSs. So the first one is 3 components, and it's a CMS that we did in Drupal 8, a touchscreen interactive that we built in React, and also a JavaScript front-end website for the CMS. So the front end of the website was built in React. And we did this for the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian. They were launching a new exhibit called Americans, and we got to partner with them to work on the interactives within the exhibit, as well as the website that was promoting the new exhibition. So a quick step through. I hand drew all of these because I got tired of my my keynote-driven boxes and arrows, so hopefully these go over well. So we had a CMS, again, that was Drupal 8. My colleague Sarah Polanski led the team that built the touchscreen interactives, again, in React. And we had a JavaScript React application that rendered the front end using data from the Drupal 8 CMS. And that was deployed to a node server on Smithsonian's architecture. So the CMS lived on their Drupal cluster, the node server housed the website, and the touchscreen was in the exhibition space itself. So this is a screenshot or just a photo of the touchscreen application up close and in the exhibit itself. It was actually the same application back to back, so people facing opposite sides of the wall could see. And this is a bit of the website that we built to promote the exhibition. I'll just let this play out a bit. It was a very complicated grid, and because it had to be this free-flowing, discoverable grid, we rapidly ended up in a situation where state became unmanageable if we tried to do this directly rendered from Drupal. So it wasn't like we said, hey, we need to use React because I just want to scratch this curiosity I have about JS. It actually was trying to solve something that we couldn't really do effectively just rendering using the theming layer of Drupal. So we've been trying as an agency to be very pragmatic and smart about when we make a decision not to use a technology just for curiosity's sake or because it's like the latest thing and we feel like all our friends are doing really cool work and we want to be like the cool kids. We really feel like we need a justification for doing this, for making that kind of technical decision. So that was for the NMAI project. This second one we just launched. So it was a CMS, again, in Drupal 8. And in this time, we had a CMS rendered website. So we used the CMS and Drupal 8's theming layer to render out the front end. So that part was not decoupled. Those two things were together. My colleague TJ, who's over there in the MTV cat, worked on this project. And but we also did digital signage, and so this was for the Man Center. Like, how many folks are from Philly here? Have any of you gone to see something at the Man Center? Yeah. Okay. Awesome. So they came to us and they said, well, we need some help with our website, but also the season, which is just all their shows during the spring, summer, and early fall, it's traditionally just a big poster. And they said, we actually want to make that dynamic. We often have changes, and reprinting that thing is actually very, very cost prohibitive. So we did some digital signage for them. So again, this architecture, I didn't really know how to represent like a non-headless thing. So I just drew like a cloud, a blob cloud that links the two. So the CMS and the front end for this are together. They're in one environment. But we also had this digital signage that consumed data from the CMS. And that was great because they could manage the events for their season in one spot and didn't really have to think about managing that content elsewhere. So the same content that drives the event listings on the Man Center website, that's the exact same data that we're providing to the digital signage. And just so you see a bit of, this is the website. And it'll take you through and you'll see a bit of the content as we scroll through for the upcoming events. And hopefully it illustrates like you can do a lot of really great front-end work still within the theming layer of Drupal. Like this kind of sort of like animation-driven stuff is not the sole province of a JavaScript framework. There are certain things, especially state management, that are helped along by being in a framework such as React or Vue. But if you're dealing with content like this, like you can go really, really far still theming within Drupal. So again, these are all events that we would pump out to the digital signage. The signage just got installed. This was just a couple of weeks ago, right, TJ? This was during install. We took a couple of quick photos. We should have had somebody there for scale, but it's a really, really, really big LED screen. Okay, so here's another architecture. And this one probably falls closest to the situation that Jody was describing, Jody from ZivTech was describing, which is you've got a CMS. The CMS is rendering the website, but there are specific React components mixed in to the theming layer. So you're using React to replace certain parts of the Drupal rendered front end. And so this was for an organization in Brooklyn called Brick. They do a lot of education around film, video, and arts, but they also run a concert series in Brooklyn. And so this is the architecture. Again, we've got a blob. The CMS is rendering it. But the calendar that I tried to draw at the very bottom, we did as a React piece. And this is just a quick, a little bit to show you. So all this is Drupal within Drupal, but we hit this page, and calendars. How many here have wrestled with the calendar module in Drupal? Yes? Okay, I feel your pain. We actually had a little bit of lead time, and we gave ourselves, I think it was about a week, and we said, if we can create a JavaScript component that can give us both a calendar view and a list view and maintain state across different taxonomy filters, like, we're going to go for it. And actually, what this application ends up doing is like the area before the React component bootstraps is actually just a Drupal view with the list of events for that month. But when JavaScript bootstraps, it replaces that view, because you can tell React, hey, replace just this target div. And so once React is like, hey, people have got JavaScript, we can bootstrap effectively, it dives in, replaces the default view, which we also had for SEO reasons, and it replaces it with the full-fledged React application. Okay, so this last one, it might be the last one. Actually, second to last one. This one is the newest one, and also the one that's a little bit furthest on the bleeding edge for us at Blue Cadet. But I thought it would be good to like throw it in here just because it was a lot of fun, and we also lost a lot of sleep trying to figure it out. So this is a CMS in Drupal 8 mixed with providing data for a statically published React application. So React isn't running, it's pre-processed by a tool called GatsbyJS, which is super fascinating. Think of it almost like Jekyll for React. So you author your React components, but you consume data, then you run it through Gatsby, and it essentially spits out a static site. So if you're concerned about JavaScript, and rightfully so, about SEO and crawlability for search and performance as well, GatsbyJS might be worth looking into for your organization. And so that, you've got a CMS. Again, this was Drupal 8. Hey, we got some JSON. It's a cloud of JSON. And in that process, it's wrapping up a statically rendered website from React. And this was the Outrider Foundation site that we launched recently that involved a lot of pretty heavy animation and some very involved interactives. And so again, we did our evaluation in the beginning and ended up deciding that for the front end, we were not going to render it in Drupal, but we were going to use a React application. This is actually a very sobering interactive because it essentially takes actual research in the potential loss of life if there is a nuclear explosion in particular, like you give it a zip code. And we partnered with somebody whose research is oriented around what the impact would be of a nuclear blast. So I situated it on Philly and just saw what different payloads would end up doing. Side note, this is also super interesting just because of like all those explosion animations were done in WebGL. That could be a whole nother talk just in and of itself, how we originally went from video loops to PNG sequences and then finally to WebGL rendered on the fly for performance reasons. So that's outrider.org. This last architecture is probably my favorite because it involves so many components, and this was for the, how many folks here have been to the Air and Space Museum down in DC, for the Smithsonian? Okay, so they came to us 2 years ago, and they wanted to do a few things. They wanted to redo their CMS. They also wanted to redo the front end, the website rendered by that CMS. They wanted to create a real showstopper piece, so they essentially wanted a big form factor that ended up being a 200-plus foot touch wall, which we did in Cinder and C++. They wanted two smaller touchscreen interactives, one for the medals and awards that they have a collection around, and the other one was for just the history of Star Trek, the original series, because they have the original model of the Enterprise. And then finally, separate iOS and Android native applications. And of course, a little bit naively, we said, sure, we can do all of that in one shot. and launch at the same time. So you've got there are still people who bear the scars of this, and I owe them for eternity now. So you have a CMS, and it's rendering. This is a Drupal 7 CMS, by the way. It's rendering the front end of the website, but it's also serving that 200-foot touch wall, the 2 touch tables, and the 2 iOS and Android applications. They both look the same because both of iOS and Android just copy from each other anyway and end up looking the same. So that is probably, and actually I didn't even draw the other CMS. That was their legacy CMS that fed data into our CMS. So actually there's one more component that I forgot to draw in this equation. We had many names for this, including the octopus, because it almost got up to like 8 different arms. And this is just a shot of the touch wall. So it's it almost did not fit in our production space. It is 7 by 3 panels. And when they shipped it and installed it, we weren't even allowed to touch it for liability reasons. The middle panel on the top was broken on delivery, and it is the biggest broken pixel I have ever seen. So that was a whale of a project. So hopefully you can see, like, there is a whole wealth of scenarios under the sun that you can use content from your CMS to drive. You know, you could use that CMS to render out and theme within Drupal, but you can also combine it with many different things, including applications that are like on your phone, applications that you create using JS that are deployed to a website or to a touch screen. Really, I want people to just broaden their imagination for where that data can go. And hopefully you will. Some pros and cons, and I should preface this by saying this is actually a trick question because many of the pros are actually cons depending on the scenario you find yourself in. But some pros, the back-end and front-end systems become swappable. So it tends to be that the content side of things in what we build are slower moving than the front end. So in this situation, you may have content modeled and in a CMS, and if you happen to need a different representation of it, or you need a different application to use that content, well, if you've decoupled those two things, your front end from your CMS layer, then you can iterate on the front end without necessarily touching what you did on the back end. This also works in reverse. We have worked on applications where originally we were running up against a legacy database or a legacy CMS, and we've successfully swapped in a newer version of the CMS. Like, so something built in Drupal 7, we've swapped out for Drupal 8, and as long as we kept the API handshake the same, we were able to do that transparently to the user. Teams can also divide and conquer. So teams can overlap without too much waiting. In many of our projects, our application developers are already off to the races. We sit down and map out a schema, a rough schema for them to use. They generate some workable content, and they're able to work in React or Angular or Vue or even native applications without waiting for the full CMS to start providing that data. So it allows us to like do some overlap in terms of our teams and get people started without having to wait in the starting blocks for the CMS and backend team, which often especially if we're doing migration work or integration work, that can often take a long time. So we get the front-end teams going before, so they're not waiting so long. Some cons. These are, a lot of times you're increasing your tech stack, right? So you're involving Drupal, JavaScript, potentially multiple environments. Like if your JavaScript stuff requires a node server, now you've got a Drupal server, a node server, and you've got the two separate applications running in different environments. That can be a lot for a team, and my team always strives to look at the potential technical debt that we're generating for anybody who's going to maintain this, whether it's ourselves or somebody else who we're handing it off to. So I do not want to trivialize this thing. Sometimes you have to ask yourself and be quite honest whether you want to do the decoupling thing and use a framework just because you want to learn React. That's not a good enough reason to do it. Please don't do that to people. But if you have very good architectural reasons this may not be a showstopper. Maintenance, again, like I said, some of these can cut both ways. Maintenance, again, because of the larger tech stack that you're covering, can be a bit of a factor, and especially if you're handing this off to an internal team, often they don't have the same breadth of capability that an agency might have. And then finally, for websites, just be aware, like if you're doing your front end in a framework or using a library like React, you are saying goodbye to a lot of the functionality that just comes straight up out of something like WordPress or Drupal. So menus, routing, accessibility, like SEO stuff, all those factors suddenly have to be factored into your front end tech stack discussion, because it's not trivial. You'll end up saying like, oh, I need this to be crawlable, and then you just go from React to like, okay, maybe it needs to hook up with Express so that it generates server-side rendered content so that Google can crawl it, and it's like you started off trying to do something here, and then you find yourself all the way on the other side of the world, wondering how you got there. So let's get into our final. So we're rounding the corner, and let's actually talk about how to do this in Drupal. So hopefully that's why most of us are here. And I always tell folks this, even though I run the dev team here in Philly, I always tell people, always start with content, right? And that sometimes just boils down to getting content ready to travel. And what I mean by that is the same way you think about decoupling your technical the portions of the technical stack, I often think of it as decoupling your mind, man. In other words, you're thinking of your content in ways that are more abstract and less tied to how they're being presented. So if you're just naming stuff, and normally you're just doing it for the website, and so you're like, oh, this is the website hero, whatever, maybe if that image asset is actually being served to a touchscreen application or a handheld, native application, maybe calling it website hero image is no longer the right name for it. Maybe it's like billboard, or even just hero alone, or primary image can be a better way to start naming your content. So just like anybody who's wrestled with CSS knows that naming is not a trivial pursuit, the same thing with getting your content ready to go. And like I said, I often think of this as more a mental thing, a mental shift that you have to make in terms of thinking less about your content being like, oh, I do something here and that's where it lives in presentation. It's more like, oh, I don't know where this could go. This could end up in like Apple News, which has its own serialization format. It could end up being consumed via JSON or RSS. Like there's so many different avenues for that content to live. And sometimes those are not even within your control. So getting your content ready to travel is a really huge thing. And it really I just start to think about like, what would this content look like in a different context? We're using it for the website right now. This teaser for an event, what does that teaser look like on an Apple Watch? If you start asking yourself those questions, you're well on your way to making sure that what you actually do in terms of the structures, content types in Drupal will support different products down the line. So I'll take you through a quick example. I've just got two content types. I'm a little bit book obsessed, not a little bit, very much book obsessed. So I was like, okay, let's just do a simple example with author and book content types. So author, really simple, 3 things. It's got a title, a body, well, 4 things. A display, I can't count apparently. Display name, and an entity reference to nodes of the type book. So the second type is book. Entity reference, we're just saying like, oh, authors can have books. And book has just a title and body, even though you can have many, 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 many different fields for a book, just keeping it simple. So how? This is not just a slide in my presentation. This is just like every day for me. How? So I'll take you through a couple of different scenarios, ranging from stuff you can do with what ships in core, to some of the latest and greatest stuff that I'm really excited about and maybe are just a little bit further on the bleeding edge. So I'm going to go through 4 things, actually. One is core RESTful web services. The second thing is custom controllers, if you want to get a little bit super specific about how you want your content to be presented. JSON API, or JSON API. We had a little bit of debate. It was almost as bad as like GIF versus GIF in the office last Thursday. Got a little tense. So JSON or JSON API. And then GraphQL, which, how many here have heard of GraphQL? Okay, so it's getting there. Still a little bit of the new kid. RESTful web services, two basic approaches. So I start here because a lot of this you can just do, like you install Drupal and it's in core, and so you don't really have to think about it. There's also REST exports, which involves a view and maybe one helper module, but still within very much out of the box. So core RESTful services, this ships. There's a core REST module. You may find it helpful to use the REST UI module, however, because it exposes some configuration that could be helpful as you set up your endpoints. Here's what a request looks like. Kind of looks like a regular request for a URL, right? Node ID. But you can pass it a format and say, hey, I want JSON. If you give me JSON. And it returns something like this, and that is not intended to be readable. It's way too much to read. But it makes a point. RESTful web services are like, you want the node? Here's the node. Like everything about the node. The mom's mom, the mom's dad, the mom's cousin, the user ID, revisions. Like, oh, you want all the history of the node? And you're like, I kind of just wanted the title, but like, okay. The full genealogy. But if we zoom in and look at this stuff, so I cut out all the other stuff I didn't care about, you are getting the things that maybe your application cares about. Right, so node ID, the type, so you know what node type it is, it's a book, the title of the book, and the various permutations of the body. So out of the box, like if you're just like, look, somebody wants this data, I've got this list of stuff, and they're like, if you give it to me in JSON, we can run with it. Core REST module, REST UI, expose the content node type, and you are good to go. And that might be all you need to do to help somebody build something really interesting using your data. REST exports. Now maybe you want to go beyond just like, oh, node/1, and you might want to do, like maybe I just want all the books. And so I don't want like every node on the site, I just want like the book nodes on the site. So this involves views, which is an old friend and very familiar. And what happens is if you enable the REST exports functionality at the bottom, or if you enable the RESTful services module, it provides you a little handy checkbox at the bottom of your view, and it says like, provide a REST export for this. So you're already making the view for something that maybe your theming layer is rendering, but at the bottom, you're like, hey, do you also want to like send this out as JSON? And you say like, okay, I'm going to put it at /API/authors. And so that's kind of what this does. And just like setting up a view with fields, you can do that for your REST export. You can say, I want the title, body, and the entity reference to books as well. So this is REST exports. And like I said, this is stuff we already know how to do. We've been doing this for years in Drupal. So again, like I said, it's not like, oh, this is a massive thing that I have to learn. Like you can baby step your way into this, providing this kind of data. And it gives you something like this. Now, I'll point out that for the book reference, if you just say, hey, like render that out, it'll just give you the ID. Right, which in traditional REST is probably good form anyway, since you might want a separate endpoint for books. So you just, when we're building applications, we want the data that's referred to, and so this kind of rubs me the wrong way. It's like, hey, give me the authors and the books, and it's like, hey, here's the authors, and here's an ID that you can use to look up the books that they wrote. And I'm like, we were so close. We were almost friends. So Step 2. This is why we at Blue Cadet often do custom controllers, because we want to do, it's usually just one more level of introspection to entity references or file entities. And we don't want, like REST exports and views, it's like, oh, okay, cool. It's like somebody taking your order and you're like, I want this, and I want to substitute the thing, and so make the chef do the thing. He's like, okay, cool. And then they give you the plate, and it's just like the lettuce. You're like, oh, man, I really wanted the other thing, too. So we often write custom controllers. The components here are actually not that complicated. You'll do some stuff in YAML. You'll just define some routes to use, or routes for your application to use, and you'll define a controller class. And so that basically says, hey, for a request to API/season, I want you to use this controller. And that controller is just a class. You can do whatever you want to within that class. So if you want to, say, get the authors and not be all passive-aggressive about, no, you have to ask me the right way, or otherwise my REST gateway is not going to give you the books too, it could also give you the books as well. So this is just an example of, this is actually taken from the Man Center, one of the controllers there, where within the controller, it's straight up like, this is very familiar. You're using an entity query, you're loading nodes off of that, looping through them, and dumping them into an array. And the only new wrinkle here is for the response, you're just returning, you're just wrapping it in a JSON response and sending it back. And that YAML config that we saw earlier just defines like the routing from API/season or whatever it was, API/authors, and it tells it to use the controller. Okay, so, and one last thing about custom controllers, that allows you both a ton of freedom, so you can also do some really, really like poor code. Like sometimes the custom controllers that I write for applications that use APIs that are not public, that are just straight up for a touchscreen, can get really gnarly. So there is some, just be disciplined when you're in there and writing your controllers. Know thyself. Okay, JSON API, 3 of 4. We're just cruising along here. This one is pretty exciting because it actually addresses some of those reasons why I and my team often do a custom controller in that level of introspection that we want. Out of the box, you get an endpoint, JSON API, node, and then content type. So for example, /node, JSON API /node/author. And you get something that looks like this. So gives you type ID, the body, and it gives you relationships, and also, so this is the UUID used by, so it's this ID down here. What? Okay. Maybe if I just, like, I feel like if I just stay on this side.
Just don't move.
Just don't move. Just, like, be very still. So that ID on the bottom is important because it's the UUID. But you can see, like, out of the box, it doesn't provide me everything. It's still pretty much like a REST export, right? It's like, hey, you asked for books, authors and books. Like, here's the authors, and here's an ID for the books. But it can also do relationships. So if you look at this, I'm just zooming in here. So zooming in, this is the core author node, and then this is the relationships object within that return JSON, and you can see it's just the UUID there. So as we all know, relationships are complicated, and JSON API tries to improve this by allowing you to include fields that might be on referenced entities. So in this case, I say, hey, I want and don't just give me the authors, give me the books too. So include equals field _ books. And it's like, okay, awesome, cool. I'm going to give you, in addition to the author stuff, I'm going to give you included, like the stuff you explicitly wanted me to go look up in the system, I'm going to give you that as well. So already we've gone like, hey, REST exports was good, but I also have to maybe query 2 separate endpoints to, like, I can get the stuff I want in one shot here using JSON API. And all I did was install a module and send it the field that I wanted to piggyback onto my main author bit. So yeah, you still, I'll go back here. This include is like a separate chunk, so you still need to like take that ID and look it up in the return chunk, but at least it's all there and you're not doing a second request. So we're close, but we're still not at the holy grail, which is like, hey, I'm going to do you a solid and give you everything in one shot. Which brings us to the last of the four, which is GraphQL. And I'm super excited about GraphQL because it seems to really get to some of those points that I was harping on earlier. A quick installation note, something that I discovered while prepping for this talk, is that typically I download a module using Drush. I'll do Drush DL module name, or I'll even just say Drush enable module name. The module for GraphQL requires Composer. It's more Composer dependent than Drush. So what I found was, even after I downloaded the module, I had to make sure I ran Composer before I enabled the module. Otherwise, it's this major GraphQL PHP library that it requires. It's like, I don't know where to find that, dude. I don't know where that is. And I'm like, hey, it's right in the. It's like you didn't use the right words. You didn't say please and Composer. So run Composer and enable it, and you should be good to go. So after you do that, it'll give you a couple of configuration settings, and one of those things allows you to test out queries. So there's this Explorer that ships with the module. You don't have to install anything else besides the GraphQL module, and it gives you this way to like essentially play with these queries that you can give to the backend. And what I like is that it's self-discovering and very contextual, in the sense that if you have entities of a particular type, it's already walked the schema and fields of those entities. And so the stuff that you end up querying for down here are contextual to the actual stuff that your system is made up of. So there's a lot less guesswork. You can start to build these queries, and it's almost like having somebody who's like a local in a city you're visiting, and it's like, oh, if you want live music, like, it's over here. It helps to have friends on the inside. And it's autocomplete, too. So here's a quick video of what the GraphQL Explorer looks like. I'm just trying to build a query. And it's like, OK, you want a query. And I was like, I want some nodes. Everybody wants nodes. And it's like, all right, you want a node query. And I was like, I want entities to go with that. It's already providing me the different things that are available to me. So I don't even have to really remember. I was just like, I think it's a label. And it's like, you want entity label? I'm like, yes, that is what I want. And so that's what this query ends up being. So after playing with the Explorer, you can like dump this into your front end of whatever you're using. It's React with Apollo or Vue.js, and you've got your query ready to go, and it'll give you something back like this. So this is interesting because it's just the fields that you ask for. Like, you look at the stuff that comes out of the box, you enable RESTful web services, it's like, here's everything, right? Like that whole everything, node, like nodes, nodes, nodes. I heard you like nodes, so I put nodes in your nodes. This is more specific. It's like, you asked me for the ID and the label, and I'm just going to give you the ID and the label. But maybe you want to go further, and you want to say, like, hey, for author, I want the ID, I want the title, I want the body, and just the value from that, and I want the display name too, and then, oh, give me books as well. So that kind of stuff, now references are easy-ish, right? Like, you're writing this query, and it's like, oh, field books is an entity reference, and it's like, okay, I can do introspection on those entities too. So it's like, you want me to dive into field books and get you the entity and title there too? Sure, gotcha. And you know, it'll give you something like this. So now I've said I want the entity ID and the title of the book, and it's happily provided it for me within this field books array on my GraphQL return my JSON package. You'll also notice that there are two empty entities up there because I only defined what to do with the authors. And so it hit 2 nodes that were books, and it's like, hey, you didn't tell me what to do with these, so I'm just returning empty stuff. Just something interesting to note. Like, it's not, it'll basically follow the query that you give it. And this is just, again, back to the query. So those empty like objects, I was like, oh, right, because I didn't tell it what to do with just books that it encounters. But maybe you just want to do a little more work up front, and you say, like, maybe I just want the author stuff. And this is like doing a view where you say content of type author, right? So you do a node query, you say, hey, these are the conditions I want you to run through before returning stuff. It's got to be a node, but I want it to be of type author. And so you can build this node query this way, and then tell it what to do with the entities. So you can define for the author, and then field books, again, is the referenced entity below. And then it starts giving you this stuff. So this is kind of like, I've just taken you through like all the way from like, I'm giving you everything, including like 80% of this stuff you don't really care about, all the way, so that was RESTful web services, all the way through to GraphQL, where it's like, oh, I'm going to give you a tool, you can build the thing, and maybe it's an API that's public and you don't really know much about it, and usually that involves looking up schema documentation and thinking like, oh, what parameters do I need to give it? Here it's like, here's an explorer. Like, you want to look up authors and books. Build your query. And it feels like a much more sane way to approach discovery of APIs for folks who really just want the data. And they're like, I don't really want to have to know how you thought up and architected your schema. I just really want to be able to get the data that I want so I can build something amazing with it. So yeah, that's GraphQL, and I'm super excited for that. Bonus round. Communication. So one thing that we've run into is that you've got your CMS stuff in like a Drupal build, and say you're like us and you build a touchscreen application, and somebody says like, oh, I just added a new piece to the exhibit. We're always like, okay, now we have to figure out how and when to update the application. How does it know that you changed some content? So this is an evergreen problem for us, and we've tried a number of different things, ranging from really stupid, which is like, all right, we're just going to ask the Drupal backend like every half hour, like, hey, you got any new content? No. Okay. No new content. Half an hour later, any new content? No, still nothing. And on the off chance that something's going to have changed. We've also tried involving more tech stack components. So Node.js, get a server in there, create a socket connection, and now you have real-time I/O that says like, oh, CMS just got updated, and they changed the name on this thing in the exhibit. So boom, the application is like listening on this socket, gets a message like, okay, update ID 234, and it goes and does its job. Downside to this is like, if you're just building like a React application over here, just getting that thing in the middle to act as like a traffic signaler can often be quite involved. So I'll end here, and that's progressive web applications feel like a really good avenue forward for me and my team. And I know, actually, I was just in the talk that TJ from Think Company gave, and he's actually starting up a new meetup around progressive web apps here in Philly. So definitely check that out if you're on this wavelength and looking to get deeper into it. So with this CMS application communication, it's definitely a use case that we deal with. Progressive web apps have service workers, which can sort of just keep doing their job in the background, even though your application is, running on a different thread. And you have push notifications. So for really simple scenarios, you might be able to just get rid of that whole Node.js architecture in the center and use the web push API. So this gives web applications the ability to receive messages pushed from a server, and that server can be your Drupal backend. The backend, the broadcaster requires a subscription to be activated. But once you say like, cool, I accept this subscription, the browser saves it, and then there's very little config. A caveat is you can pass messages. Really, you're just passing data from the back end to your app or your website. You're just saying like, hey, something happened, and it's up to the application to interpret that how they will. And again, browsers handle pushing the data through service workers, so you're no longer routing it through like a node server somewhere. Fine print. Limited browser support. Chrome, Firefox, so far we've tested. Safari's like, oh, we got service workers, but some other stuff still needs to get there. It's like almost there. The spec is considered experimental, might change. And we've found that it's great for kiosks, especially those that we build in JS. But in the wild, if you're dealing with like a React website, you can't always guarantee that the user will subscribe. So there's like a bit of an adoption, like on-ramp issue there. And so we're still looking for other projects that we do in Cinder and C++. Obviously, we don't have access to service workers because those are JavaScript. So we're still looking at sockets for non-web-based projects that we do in Cinder or Unity. But last demo. This is, again, for the web CMS for the Man Center on the right, running on a test environment. And this is actually the application that runs on the LED massive display screen. But since it's React, it runs in a browser, and we can test it. So we subscribed to the Drupal 8 CMS for web push notifications. And my colleague, Pete Inge, who also gave a talk earlier, started testing them. So we want to display this alert in case, say, beer runs out at the Man Center, or there's a missing child, something more important. And this was like our very first prototype with web push. We were like, okay, because we had already talked about like, okay, let's stand up a node server in the middle. But Pete took about a couple of days and wrote just like a small custom module to handle the subscriptions in Drupal 8. And then the rest was just web push and service workers. And the application is just listening for a particular message that says alert, and then it just does its job. We pass the alert like key and then just this string of text. And that's all we really needed for it to do its job. So where to next? Two-way communication. If you can talk to an application, you should be able to listen as well. So that's something we're thinking about. And that, again, Drupal and WordPress are all over this. They're starting to think about content authoring, using front-end JS technologies, and using APIs that and using that to publish. Takeaways, just to wrap up. Start with your content. Make that portable. There's many different ways, so I showed you 4 different ways to expose your content. And definitely you can do this. Like, I hope all those different architectures showed you. There's so many different ways that you can do decoupled architectures, ranging from the like, oh, I'm just going to jam this little React jobby here in my site, to like 7 products all using the same API. And finally, yes, we're hiring. I don't know why that's rendering so weirdly, but we are hiring for Drupal folks. So if that's something that sounds interesting to you, talk to me later. And thank you. Sorry for the delay because of the gremlins up there. But also, that URL is super long, and I didn't realize it was going to take the exact title of my presentation and just serialize it into a URL. So I'll tweet that out and update the node description in the Drupaldelphia site with the URL, because I realize that's a ridiculously long URL. Anyway, thank you, everyone.